My wife died in a sudden car accident. Just a few days later, a corporate notary handed me the keys to a luxury penthouse, telling me it was now entirely in my name. While she was alive, my wife had strictly forbidden me from asking about her frequent business trips and wellness retreats. I planned to sell the place immediately, but before doing so, I decided to visit. When I swiped the key fob and opened the door, I froze in absolute shock. Sitting in the middle of the ruined living room was the last person I ever expected to see. I am Harrison Cole. I am 70 years old and somehow still trying to heal from the devastating wounds my own family inflicted on me. As a retired structural engineer, I spent my entire life building strong foundations for my wife and children, only to discover they were quietly destroying it all from the inside. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who took your love for granted and underestimated your worth. The nightmare did not begin with the discovery of the penthouse. It began 3 days earlier under the freezing, relentless rain of Seattle, Washington. I stood at the edge of a freshly dug grave watching the polished wooden casket of my wife Martha being lowered into the cold earth. We had been married for 42 years. For more than 4 decades, she had been the center of my universe, the woman I worked 80-hour weeks for, the mother of my children. Standing there in my black suit, feeling the icy rain soak through my umbrella, I felt a profound, hollow numbness. My mind simply refused to process that she was gone. Across from me stood my son Derek. He was 40 years old, dressed in a sharp, expensive suit, holding an umbrella over his wife Monica. Monica had been in the car with Martha when the crash happened. She had survived with a fractured arm and some bruised ribs while my wife had perished on impact. Monica was sobbing loudly. The sound echoed through the quiet cemetery, sharp and piercing. Even through my overwhelming grief, something about her cries bothered me. As a man who had spent a lifetime analyzing the structural integrity of buildings, my brain was wired to notice when things did not bear weight correctly. Monica's crying felt hollow. It felt performative, like an actress trying too hard to convince the audience of her sorrow. I watched Derek wrap his arm around her shoulders, his face a mask of solemn grief, but his eyes were darting around the attendees, calculating and alert. I pushed the thought away, blaming my exhaustion and the trauma of the sudden loss. I told myself I was just a grieving old man looking for things that were not there. The next 3 days were a blur of empty rooms and unbearable silence. Our large suburban home, the house I had built from the ground up to raise our family, suddenly felt like a tomb. I wandered from the kitchen to the living room, staring at Martha's reading glasses left on the coffee table, her favorite coffee mug sitting unwashed by the sink. I was completely lost in a fog of sorrow until the shrill ringing of the telephone shattered the quiet on Thursday morning. I picked up the receiver expecting another condolence call from a distant relative. Instead, the voice on the other end belonged to a man named Thomas Harding. He introduced himself as a corporate attorney representing a private wealth management firm in downtown Seattle. He respectfully offered his condolences and then insisted that I come to his office immediately. He said there were pressing legal matters regarding Martha's estate that could not wait. I was deeply confused. Martha was a stay-at-home mother. She had never managed our finances. I had always handled the investments, the retirement accounts, and the family trust. I told Harding there must be a mistake, but he calmly assured me there was no mistake and urged me to come down as soon as possible. An hour later, I was sitting in a high-back leather chair in a sleek, glass-walled office overlooking the Seattle skyline. Thomas Harding, a man in his late 60s with a serious professional demeanor, sat across from his heavy mahogany desk. Without much small talk, he opened a thick manila folder and slid a set of sleek black electronic key fobs across the polished wood toward me. He looked at me with a mixture of professional detachment and quiet sympathy. He told me that my wife was the sole owner of a limited liability company, and under that company she owned a luxury penthouse in the financial district. The property was valued at over $4 million. Because she had passed away without a specific secondary will for this company, and because I was her legal spouse, the property and the company automatically defaulted to my name. I stared at the black key fobs as if they were venomous snakes. My hands began to tremble. I told Harding that this was impossible. I explained that Martha had no independent income, that I had provided every dollar she ever spent, and that we did not own any real estate in the downtown financial district. Harding quietly turned a document around so I could see it. It was the deed of purchase stamped and notarized 2 years ago, bearing Martha's unmistakable signature. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin. I could not breathe. $4 million. How could a woman who asked me for grocery money afford a $4 million piece of real estate? Where did the money come from? Harding gently explained that the funds had been wired from an offshore holding account, but client confidentiality and banking firewalls prevented him from seeing the exact origin of the money. His job was simply to execute the transfer of the asset to me. I took the key fobs, my mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. I walked out of that office feeling like the ground beneath my feet had completely vanished. I got into my car, the rain drumming a steady, depressing rhythm against the windshield. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring blindly at the steering wheel. Memories of my marriage began to flood my mind, but now they were tainted with a dark, creeping suspicion. I thought about the last few years. I thought about Martha's frequent absences. She had always claimed she was going on wellness retreats with her women's group or attending out-of-state botanical conventions. She had strictly forbidden me from asking questions, saying I needed to respect her independence and her need for a private life after spending decades raising our children. Because I loved her, and because my demanding career had kept me away from home so often when I was younger, I had given her that space. I had trusted her completely. I had written off her secrecy as a harmless quirk of aging. Now that blind trust felt like a physical weight crushing my chest. I pulled out my cell phone with shaking hands. If she had millions of dollars hidden away, I needed to check our own accounts. I opened my banking application, intending to check the joint family trust and my primary retirement fund, which held the $8 million I had saved over a lifetime of hard labor. I typed in my password. The screen blinked red. Access denied. I typed it again, slower this time, making sure my trembling fingers hit the right keys. Access denied. Password has been changed. A cold, paralyzing terror washed over me. I tried to reset the password, but the security alerts informed me that the primary recovery email had been altered months ago. I was completely locked out of the financial foundation I had spent 40 years building. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. The grief I felt for my dead wife was rapidly being replaced by a terrifying, agonizing confusion. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I needed answers, and the only place I was going to find them was in that penthouse. But I put the car in gear and drove toward the financial district. The city felt gray and oppressive. Every traffic light seemed to mock my desperation. When I finally pulled up to the address Harding had given me, I found myself staring up at a towering structure of dark glass and steel. It was one of the most exclusive, high-security residential buildings in Seattle. I walked into the grand lobby, my cheap raincoat dripping water onto the pristine marble floor. I approached the concierge desk and presented my ID along with the legal paperwork Harding had provided. The concierge, a young man in a tailored suit, gave me a polite nod and directed me to the private elevator reserved for the penthouse suites. The elevator ride was agonizingly silent and fast. My ears popped as I ascended to the top floor. I stepped out into a private hallway bathed in soft, warm light. At the end of the hall stood a massive, heavy oak door with brass trimmings. I stood before it holding the black key fob. My breathing was shallow and ragged. I expected to walk into a pristine secret sanctuary. I expected to find the hidden life of a woman who had deceived me. I expected to find evidence of a secret lover, or hidden bank statements, or simply an empty, luxurious space. I raised the key fob to the electronic scanner. The lock clicked open with a heavy metallic thud. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. I froze. My entire body went completely rigid. The penthouse was not a pristine sanctuary. It was a war zone. The vast living room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the stormy Seattle skyline, was utterly destroyed. Custom Italian leather sofas had been sliced open, white stuffing scattered across the dark hardwood floors like snow. Expensive abstract paintings had been ripped from the walls and stomped on. Books, crystal vases, and designer lamps were smashed into pieces. Someone had methodically and violently torn the place apart. But it was not the destruction that made my heart stop. It was the people sitting in the middle of it. Kneeling on the floor among the debris, breathing heavily with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, was my son Derek. In his hand he gripped a heavy steel crowbar. Standing a few feet away from him, pouring a glass of whiskey from a shattered bar cart, was a young, incredibly fit man in his early 30s. The stranger was wearing nothing but expensive slacks and a dark silk lounging robe. The heavy door clicked shut behind me. The sound echoed through the ruined room like a gunshot. Derek snapped his head up. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him as pale as a ghost. The crowbar slipped from his trembling hand, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, his chest heaving. The stranger in the silk robe froze the whiskey glass, pausing halfway to his lips. He looked from Derek to me, his expression tightening into a mask of guarded panic. "Dad," Derek whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of the smooth confidence he always carried. "Dad, what are you doing here?" The cold metal of the electronic key fobs pressed into my palm as I rode the elevator down from Thomas Harding's office. $4 million. The number echoed in my mind. It made absolutely no sense. I stepped out into the lobby and walked through the sliding glass doors into the relentless Seattle rain. The freezing drizzle soaked through my coat, but I barely felt it. My body was numb, anesthetized by profound confusion. I walked toward the parking garage like a man navigating a waking nightmare. Every step felt heavier than the last. I was a structural engineer. For 40 years, I made a living calculating weight loads and ensuring foundations were poured deep enough to withstand any storm. My brain was trained to seek logic, but there was no logic here. A stay-at-home mother with no independent income does not secretly purchase a luxury penthouse. The structural integrity of my life was fracturing beneath my feet. I reached my car, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the rain streaking across the windshield. I had built a highly successful construction firm from nothing. I worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificing my youth sleep and hobbies to ensure my family would never know poverty. I missed school plays, anniversary dinners, and weekend mornings because I was out on muddy construction sites pouring concrete. I did it all for Martha. I did it for Derek and Sarah. I wanted them to have a fortress of financial security. Martha managed the home, and I managed the money. She asked for a household allowance, and I provided it without a second thought. I never scrutinized the credit card bills. I loved her, believing our division of labor was a partnership built on absolute trust. Sitting in the damp chill of my car, memories began to surface, taking on a sinister shape. Over the past decade, Martha had changed. It was gradual at first. She began taking frequent trips, leaving for days at a time. She called them women's wellness retreats. She would pack a designer suitcase, kiss my cheek, and tell me not to wait up. Whenever I asked for details about where she was going, her demeanor would instantly shift. She became defensive, her voice sharpening with a cold edge. She told me she had spent her adult life raising my children and supporting my career, and she deserved a private life. She demanded independence. She established strict boundaries, explicitly forbidding me from calling her during those weekends unless it was an emergency. Because I carried the guilt of an absent, hard-working father, I conceded. I respected her rules. I gave her the space she demanded, convincing myself it was a small price for her happiness. Now, in the gloomy light of the parking garage, I realized my blind trust had been a fatal miscalculation. I had ignored the subtle warning signs. I ignored the new designer clothes she claimed she bought on clearance. I ignored the hushed phone calls she ended abruptly the moment I walked into the room. A sickening dread began to pool in my stomach. The math simply did not add up. A $4 million penthouse could not be bought with leftover grocery money. There had to be an explanation, and the logical conclusion was one I desperately did not want to face. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped the device. If Martha had access to millions of dollars, I needed to check our accounts immediately. I opened my banking application, navigating to the Joint Family Trust and my primary retirement fund. That fund held $8 million, the culmination of every drop of sweat I had endured over 4 decades. It was the money meant to secure our final years and leave a legacy for our children. I typed in my password, my breath catching in my throat. I pressed enter. A red error message flashed across the screen. Access denied. I blinked, wiping rainwater from my forehead. I must have typed it incorrectly. I was tired, grieving, and not thinking straight. I carefully retyped the password. I hit enter again. Access denied. Password has been changed. A cold terror washed over me. The air in the car felt suffocating. I tapped the screen, frantically selecting the password recovery option. A prompt appeared stating a verification code had been sent to the primary email address on file. But the email address partially displayed on the screen was not mine. It was an encrypted, anonymous account I did not recognize. The security settings had been completely overhauled. I was totally locked out of the financial foundation I had spent 40 years building. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, pounding a frantic rhythm of panic. I tried calling the bank's customer service line, but without the new security PIN, the system refused to grant me access. The grief I felt for my dead wife just 3 days ago evaporated entirely. It was rapidly replaced by a terrifying, agonizing realization. I did not know the woman I had just buried. The Martha I loved, the gentle woman I thought I was protecting, was an illusion. She had orchestrated a massive takeover of my life savings right beneath my nose, using the trust I had given her as her weapon. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. I could not wait for the bank to open on Monday to confirm it. I had been wiped out. I needed answers today. I needed to know what my wife had been doing in that luxury high-rise, who she had been hiding there, and where my life's work had gone. I put the car in gear and tore out of the parking garage. The drive toward the financial district was a blur of flashing brake lights and blinding rain. My mind was a storm of dark, racing thoughts. I resolved to go to that penthouse, tear it apart if I had to, pack up whatever secrets were hidden inside, and sell it. Once I had my answers, I would list the property on the market and use the funds to try and salvage whatever was left of my ruined life. I pulled up to the address. It was a towering structure of dark glass and steel, an exclusive residential building that screamed of hidden wealth. I parked my car in the underground garage and walked up into the lobby. I approached the private elevator reserved for the penthouse suites. My jaw clenched, my body humming with adrenaline. The elevator ride was agonizingly fast, my ears popping as I ascended to the top floor. I stepped out into a quiet, softly lit private hallway. At the end of the corridor stood a massive, heavy oak door. I stood before it, clutching the black key fob in my hand. My breathing was shallow and ragged. I swiped the fob against the electronic scanner. The heavy oak door clicks open, revealing a truth I was never meant to see. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside the penthouse. I froze. My body went rigid. The luxury apartment was a war zone. Custom leather sofas had been sliced open, white stuffing scattered across the dark floors. Expensive, abstract paintings were ripped from the walls. Bookshelves were overturned. Crystal vases were smashed into jagged pieces. Someone had violently torn the place apart, searching for something with terrifying desperation. But the destruction did not make my heart stop. It was the people sitting in the middle of the chaos. Kneeling among the debris, gripping a scuffed steel crowbar, was my son. Derek, my 40-year-old son, who had barely been able to stand at his mother's funeral 3 days ago. Standing a few feet away, casually pouring a glass of whiskey from a shattered bar cart, was a young, fit man. The stranger wore nothing but expensive slacks and a dark silk lounging robe. The door clicked shut behind me. The noise echoed through the ruined room like a gunshot. Derek snapped his head up. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale as a ghost. The crowbar slipped from his trembling hand, clattering against the floor. He stared at me with terrified eyes. The stranger in the silk robe froze the whiskey glass, pausing halfway to his lips. He looked from Derek to me, his expression tightening into a mask of guarded panic. "Dad." Derek whispered, his voice cracking under the sudden pressure. "What are you doing here?" The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. I stood rooted to the spot. I looked at the shredded furniture, the shattered glass, and the crowbar near my son's expensive shoes. Then I looked directly into Derek's eyes. I saw raw, unfiltered panic. It was the unmistakable look of a trapped animal. But Derek had always been a masterful manipulator. Right before my eyes, the frantic criminal vanished. He was instantly replaced by the concerned, grieving son I thought I knew. He stepped forward, his posture slumping to mirror my exhaustion. His voice was incredibly soft, laced with manufactured sorrow. He asked me to sit down, apologizing for the mess. He reached out to guide me by the shoulder. I let him lead me away from the doorway, forcing my body to remain limp. I played the part of the confused widower, perfectly allowing him to guide me to an intact chair. I sat down heavily, asking what happened and who the man standing by the bar was. Derek sighed, running a trembling hand through his hair. He looked down at me with profound pity. He explained the man across the room was Damien, an exclusive real estate broker. Derek claimed my wife had secretly purchased this penthouse as a massive surprise for my upcoming retirement. His voice cracked. He told me that after the crash, he discovered a file in Martha's office detailing the purchase. However, the physical deed was missing. He claimed he had rushed here with Damien to search. He spun a tale about how the probate court was going to freeze Martha's assets by the end of the week. He said he was desperately tearing the place apart to find the deed hidden in the walls, hoping to secure the property in my name before the state locked it away. He just wanted to protect his mother's final gift, he whispered, wiping a non-existent tear. Damien stepped out from behind the cart, moving with practiced grace. He poured a glass of cold water from a crystal pitcher. He walked over, holding the glass out, with a look of professional sympathy. He introduced himself in a soothing voice, offering his condolences. He told me my wife was a wonderful woman who spoke of me constantly. He apologized for the state of the apartment, echoing Derek's story. I took the glass from his hand. I noticed his skin was warm, his grip entirely too relaxed for a man caught in a chaotic situation. I took a slow sip. I looked up at Derek, nodding slowly, letting my shoulders sag. I thanked him for trying to protect me. I told him I was tired and confused by everything the corporate lawyer had told me. I played the role of the clueless, grieving old man to absolute perfection. I watched the tension drain from Derek's body. He let out a breath he had been holding, convinced his quick thinking had saved him. But inside my mind, a completely different process was taking place. I was a structural engineer. My entire career was built on the ability to look at a building and instantly identify the stress points, the hidden fractures, and the dangerous lies hidden beneath a fresh coat of paint. As I sat there sipping the water, my analytical brain began tearing Derek's story apart piece by piece, examining the catastrophic structural failure of his plausible lie. First, there was the destruction itself. A man looking for a paper document does not systematically slice open custom leather cushions and rip the padding out. You do not smash crystal vases and stomp on expensive artwork to find a folded deed. This level of devastation was not a search. It was a violent interrogation of the physical space. It was destruction born of terrifying desperation. They were not looking for a piece of paper. They were looking for something small, something incredibly valuable, and they were furious they could not find it. Second, there was the physical evidence. I looked at the steel crowbar lying on the floor. It was scuffed and covered in white plaster dust from where it had been swung repeatedly into the drywall. Then I looked at Derek's hands. His knuckles were raw split and bleeding slightly. The bruising was dark and fresh. A loving son trying to spare his father from probate court does not swing a crowbar with enough force to tear his own hands apart. The physical toll on his body spoke of a deep panic. Finally, there was Damien. Derek had introduced him as a high-end real estate broker. But I had spent decades dealing with corporate brokers. I knew exactly how they moved, how they spoke, and how they presented themselves. A luxury real estate broker does not arrive at a $4 million property to conduct an emergency search wearing a dark silk lounging robe and soft indoor slippers. He does not pour himself a glass of top-shelf whiskey in the middle of a workday while tearing apart a client's living room. Furthermore, as Damien had leaned in to hand me the glass of water, the silk lapel of his robe had shifted slightly. I had excellent vision for a man my age. Embroidered across the left breast pocket in elegant silver thread were two distinct initials. They were not a corporate logo. They read D&D. They did not stand for Martha. They did not stand for a real estate agency. They stood for something deeply personal, something intimate that belonged in this space long before I ever swiped that key fob at the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing us inside the devastated penthouse. My son Derek knelt amidst the wreckage of a $4 million secret. The mask slipped. I saw raw terror in his eyes. His chest heaved as he stared at me, knuckles white around the scuffed crowbar. He looked like a trapped animal realizing the cage had just snapped shut. But my son had always been an exceptional performer. I watched as the frantic criminal vanished before my eyes. In a heartbeat, he smoothed his expression. The panic was swallowed whole, replaced instantly by the deeply concerned, grieving demeanor he had flawlessly perfected at his mother's funeral 3 days ago. He dropped the crowbar. The heavy metal clattered against the hardwood. He took a tentative step toward me, hands raised in a placating gesture. His voice was soft, laced with a manufactured sorrow that made my stomach turn. He asked me to sit down, apologizing profusely for the shocking state of the apartment. He reached out to guide me by the shoulder. I let him touch me, forcing my muscles to remain completely limp. I allowed him to steer me toward an intact velvet armchair. I sank into the chair heavily, letting out a shuddering breath. I looked up at him with bewildered eyes, asking him what had happened here and who the stranger standing by the bar was. He looked down at me with profound pity. He gestured toward the young athletic man in the dark silk lounging robe. Derek cleared his throat and explained that the man across the room was Damien, an exclusive real estate broker who catered only to wealthy clients in the financial district. Derek knelt beside my chair, placing a comforting hand on my knee. He claimed my wife had secretly purchased this magnificent penthouse as a surprise for my upcoming retirement. According to Derek, Martha had spent the last 2 years quietly furnishing the place, intending to reveal it to me on our next anniversary. He told me that after the crash, he had been going through her files. He discovered a hidden folder detailing the purchase, but the physical notarized deed was completely missing. He looked around the destroyed room with desperate sadness. He told me the probate court was going to freeze all of Martha's assets by the end of the week. He rushed down here with Damien to conduct an emergency search. He claimed they were tearing the place apart to find the deed, hoping to secure the property in my name before the state locked it away. He swore he was only trying to spare me the unbearable stress of fighting a legal system while I was mourning my wife. He just wanted to protect his mother's final gift, he whispered, wiping a non-existent tear from his cheek. Damien stepped out from behind the shattered bar cart. He poured a glass of cold water from an intact crystal pitcher. He walked over to me, holding the glass out with professional sympathy. He introduced himself in a smooth voice, offering sincere condolences for my loss. He told me my wife was a wonderful woman who spoke of me constantly. He apologized for the chaotic state of the apartment, smoothly corroborating Derek's frantic story. I reached out with a trembling hand and took the glass. As our fingers brushed, I noticed his skin was warm, his grip entirely too relaxed for a highly stressful situation. I took a slow sip, letting the cold liquid soothe my throat. I looked up at Derek, nodding slowly, letting my shoulders sag. I thanked my son for trying to protect me. I told him I was so tired, so deeply confused by everything the lawyer had told me earlier. I played the role of the clueless, broken old man perfectly. I watched the tension drain out of Derek's body. He let out a breath he had clearly been holding, convinced his quick thinking and emotional manipulation had saved him from discovery. He patted my knee again, assuring me that he and Damien would handle the mess and sort out the legal paperwork. Inside my mind, a completely different process was taking place. I was a structural engineer. My entire career was built on the ability to look at a complex building and instantly identify hidden stress points, microscopic fractures, and dangerous lies concealed beneath a fresh coat of paint. As I sat there sipping the water, my analytical brain began tearing Derek's story apart, piece by piece, examining the catastrophic structural failure of his plausible lie. First, there was the physical nature of the destruction. A man looking for a folded paper document does not systematically slice open custom leather cushions and rip the padding out. You do not smash thick crystal vases and stomp on framed artwork to find a deed. This level of devastation was not a search. It was destruction born of a terrifying, chaotic desperation. They were not looking for a piece of paper. They were hunting for something incredibly valuable, and they were furious they could not find it. Second, there was the physical evidence on my son's body. I looked at the heavy steel crowbar, scuffed and covered in white plaster dust from where it had been swung into the drywall. Then I looked at Derek's hands. His knuckles were raw, split open, and bleeding slightly. The dark bruising was fresh and severe. A loving son, trying to spare his father from a tedious probate court battle, does not blindly swing a heavy crowbar with enough furious force to tear his own hands apart. The physical toll on his body spoke of a primal panic. Finally, there was the man standing beside him. Derek had confidently introduced Damien as a high-end real estate broker, but I had spent 4 decades dealing with corporate brokers and wealthy developers. I knew exactly how they moved and presented themselves. A luxury real estate broker does not conduct an emergency search wearing a dark silk lounging robe and soft indoor slippers. He does not lazily pour himself a thick glass of top-shelf whiskey in the middle of a workday. Furthermore, as Damien had leaned in to hand me the glass of water, the silk lapel of his expensive robe had shifted slightly in the light. Embroidered across the pocket in silver thread were 2 distinct initials. They were not a corporate logo. They read D&D. They did not stand for Martha. They did not stand for a real estate agency. They stood for something deeply personal, something highly intimate and secretive that truly belonged in this specific space long before I ever swiped that electronic key fob. My blinding grief was completely gone right now, replaced by a cold, calculating, and undeniable clarity. They truly thought I was a pathetic, trusting fool who would swallow any convenient lie they eagerly offered. They believed they had successfully managed the highly volatile situation, but they had just arrogantly handed me the exact blueprint to their own inevitable destruction, and I was quietly preparing to carefully read every single highly destructive line. I set the crystal glass down on an intact table, making sure my hand trembled. I looked at Derek, letting my shoulders slump, projecting the image of a defeated old man. I told him I would leave them to their search. I said the legal jargon and the shock of seeing this place were simply too much for my fragile heart to handle today. I thanked him for taking on this terrible burden. Derek stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. I hugged my son back. Beneath his suit jacket, I could feel the tight tension in his muscles. He was vibrating with adrenaline. I pulled away and offered a weak smile to the stranger in the silk robe. I told Damien I appreciated his dedication and hoped he would excuse my departure. Damien offered a polite nod, securing the silk lapel. I turned around and slowly shuffled out of the ruined living room, keeping my head bowed until I crossed the threshold and pulled the heavy door shut behind me. The moment the latch clicked into place, the pathetic facade dropped entirely. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back. I walked down the quiet hallway with purposeful strides. I pressed the button for the elevator, my mind racing with terrifying clarity. When the steel doors slid open, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the parking garage. As the elevator began its descent, I stared at my reflection in the mirrored walls. I did not look like a man who had just buried his wife. I looked like a man preparing for war. The pieces of Derek's plausible lie were crumbling. I thought about the heavy crowbar and the bloody contusions on my son's knuckles. Those injuries were not sustained by simply prying off baseboards to find a document. That was the physical evidence of blind rage. Someone had been furiously destroying that penthouse because they could not find what they were desperately hunting for. And then there was the monogram. 2 silver letters embroidered on the chest of a man pretending to be a real estate broker. D&D, not Martha's initials, not a corporate logo. Damien and Derek. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My son was not conducting a desperate search on behalf of his dead mother. He was tearing apart a $4 million property that already belonged to him, or at least a property he shared with the man in the silk robe. Damien was not a broker. He was intimately connected to Derek. They were completely comfortable together in that space, drinking top-shelf whiskey amidst total devastation. But if this penthouse was secretly theirs, why was the deed legally tied to a shell company solely controlled by my deceased wife? Why would Martha lock away a luxury asset in her own name, completely hiding it from me, only for my son to be the one furiously destroying it after her sudden death? The sheer magnitude of the deception was staggering. I had spent my entire life building a fortune to protect my family, believing we were united by absolute trust. Instead, I had been unknowingly financing a sprawling labyrinth of secrets, lies, and hidden lives. The elevator chimed softly, announcing my arrival at the garage. The doors slid open, revealing the concrete expanse. I walked briskly to my vehicle, the echoing sound of my footsteps the only noise in the garage. I unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, shutting the door firmly against the damp chill of the Seattle afternoon. I did not start the engine. I simply sat there in the quiet isolation of the cabin, staring blankly at the concrete wall ahead. My breathing was slow and measured. I needed to isolate the variables just as I would when analyzing a collapsing bridge. Martha was dead. Derek was lying. Damien was a secret. And millions of dollars from my retirement accounts had vanished into an untraceable void. But there was one variable I had not yet accounted for in this catastrophic equation. Monica. My daughter-in-law had been in the passenger seat when the fatal car crash occurred. She had survived with minimal injuries while my wife was killed on impact. I thought about her behavior at the cemetery 3 days ago. Her loud, theatrical sobbing, the way she clung to Derek, the strange, unsettling feeling I had when I watched her. I reached up and unclipped the high-definition dashboard camera mounted behind my rearview mirror. I had installed it years ago for insurance purposes, but it possessed a wide-angle lens and a highly sensitive audio recording function. During the burial service, my car had been parked on a slight incline directly overlooking the gravesite. I had left the engine idling for a few minutes, while the funeral director arranged the seating, meaning the camera had captured a clear, unobstructed view of the mourners before I finally turned it off. I pulled the memory card from the device. I opened the glove compartment and retrieved my work laptop. I booted up the computer, the bright screen illuminating the dark interior of the car. I inserted the memory card and opened the video files, searching for the timestamp of the burial. The high-resolution video began to play. The rain-soaked cemetery appeared on the screen. I watched myself standing near the polished wooden casket, an oblivious figure holding a black umbrella. Then I dragged the cursor across the screen, panning the camera view toward the other side of the grave. I found Derek and Monica standing together. I pressed pause. I used the video enhancement software on my laptop to zoom in tightly on Monica's face. The pixelated image sharpened into striking clarity. I pressed play again, watching the footage frame by frame in slow motion. Her shoulders were heaving. She held a damp tissue to her face, projecting the perfect image of a heartbroken survivor. But the digital zoom revealed a terrifying truth that my naked eyes had missed in the chaotic grief of the moment. Monica was not crying. Not a single tear fell from her eyes. Beneath the protective cover of the white tissue, her jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in her neck stood out in sharp relief. But it was her eyes that truly chilled my blood. She was not looking at the casket containing the woman she had supposedly loved like a mother. She was not looking at the priest delivering the final blessings. She had her head turned slightly to the side, her gaze locked entirely on her husband. She was staring at Derek. It was not a look of shared sorrow or marital comfort. It was a look of pure, venomous hatred. Her eyes were dark, unblinking, and filled with a cold, calculating malice. The kind of look a predator gives its prey right before the final strike. The accident was not a tragedy born of slippery roads and bad weather. Monica knew exactly what had happened in that car, and she knew exactly what Derek was desperately searching for in the ruined penthouse. I closed my laptop and placed it on the passenger seat. Heavy rain drummed against the roof of my car, matching the frantic pounding of my heart. I drove out of the parking garage, leaving the towering glass structure behind me. The drive back to my home was a blur of gray skies and sweeping windshield wipers. My mind was consumed by Monica staring at Derek with that venomous hatred. If the crash had not been an accident, my entire reality was constructed on lethal deception. I pulled into my driveway, staring at the quiet house. It stood exactly as I left it, a monument to a lifetime of hard labor, yet it now felt like a hollow shell. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The silence of the foyer was suffocating. There was no warmth left in these walls. I took off my damp coat, my movements stiff and mechanical, and walked toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of cold water. Before I reached the kitchen counter, the shrill ringing of the landline shattered the dead quiet of the house. The sound made me flinch. Very few people ever called the landline anymore. I walked over to the wall-mounted phone, staring at the caller identification screen. It was my beautiful daughter, Sarah. I picked up the receiver, forcing my voice to sound steady and comforting, masking the turmoil churning inside my chest. I said her name gently, but I was instantly cut off by the sound of her frantic, hysterical sobbing. Sarah was a resilient, hard-working mother of two, married to a decent man named Jason. She was not prone to emotional outbursts or dramatic breakdowns. Hearing her weep with such raw desperation sent a spike of genuine alarm through my veins. I tightened my grip on the plastic receiver, asking her what was wrong, begging her to take a deep breath and clearly explain the situation to me. Through her ragged tears, Sarah managed to choke out words that made absolutely no sense to me. She told me she had just received a final notice from the bank. Her house was going into foreclosure. The bank was initiating the property seizure process by the end of the month, and they were going to lose their family home. I stood frozen in the kitchen, completely bewildered. When Sarah and Jason bought their beautiful home 5 years ago, they had taken on a substantial mortgage. To ensure they never had to worry about losing their roof, I had set up an automatic monthly transfer from a secondary family trust fund directly into their mortgage account. It was an unbreakable financial failsafe, a quiet blanket of security I proudly provided so my daughter could sleep peacefully at night without the crushing weight of debt. I told her firmly that there must be some kind of clerical mistake. I assured her that the trust fund was fully capitalized and that the automatic payments were scheduled to run perpetually. Sarah let out a heartbreaking, bitter sob that tore through my chest. She told me there was no mistake. The bank manager had just personally informed her that the automatic transfers from the Cole Family Trust had been abruptly canceled exactly 24 months ago. She asked me, her voice breaking with profound betrayal and deep confusion, why I had stopped paying. She asked why I had cruelly cut them off without a single word of warning, leaving them to unknowingly drown in accumulated debt and compounding interest penalties until it was far too late to ever recover. My legs felt like they were rapidly turning to heavy lead. I leaned heavily against the kitchen counter, the entire room spinning dizzily around me. I told my daughter, my voice dropping to a hoarse, horrified whisper, that I had never stopped those payments. I swore to her on my life that I had not touched that trust fund. I promised Sarah I would fix this terrible situation immediately, that I would go directly to the bank, transfer whatever funds were necessary to halt the devastating foreclosure, and call her back the exact moment it was fully resolved. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling so badly I could barely place the receiver back on the hook. If the secure trust fund payments had been maliciously canceled 2 years ago, the exact time frame Martha had supposedly purchased that $4 million luxury penthouse, the financial rot was spreading much faster and much deeper than I could have ever anticipated. I had been locked out of the joint accounts on my cellular phone earlier this afternoon, but I had one remaining fortress, my private home office. I kept a secure, hardwired desktop computer in my quiet study, completely disconnected from the wireless network, requiring a biometric fingerprint scan to access my master financial portfolio. It was the central hub where I strictly managed the $8 million primary retirement fund I had painstakingly built over 40 relentless years in the highly competitive structural engineering business. I abandoned the kitchen and moved down the long hallway with a frantic, desperate urgency. I pushed open the door to my study, a room Martha rarely entered. The heavy mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, exactly as I had left it. I dropped into the leather executive chair and pressed my right thumb firmly against the biometric scanner embedded in the keyboard. The machine whirred to life, recognizing my unique fingerprint. The large monitor flickered on, bypassing the altered passwords and secondary security protocols that had barred me on my mobile device. I opened my encrypted financial management software, my heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against my aching ribs. I clicked on the primary retirement portfolio, the massive account containing every drop of sweat, every missed holiday, and every exhausted night I had endured to permanently secure my family's future. The loading screen seemed to mock me, spinning slowly for 5 agonizing seconds. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the mahogany desk, bracing myself to analyze the damage, desperately hoping there was still enough capital left to save my daughter's home. The screen finally refreshed, fully loading the main financial dashboard. I stopped breathing entirely. The air was violently sucked from my lungs. The sharp, agonizing pain in my chest felt identical to a massive heart attack tearing through my body. My vision blurred and a loud ringing erupted in my ears. I leaned closer to the monitor, refusing to believe the numbers displaying clearly across the screen. The available balance was exactly $0.00. $8 million was completely gone, stolen by the woman I deeply loved. The entire foundation of my life's work had been vaporized. My hands moved frantically over the keyboard, clicking into the detailed transaction history. The ledger populated, revealing a methodical massacre. The bleeding had started exactly 24 months ago. Every single month, massive wire transfers had been executed. Every dollar had been systematically funneled into a highly encrypted, untraceable offshore cryptocurrency exchange platform. I realized I had not just been lied to. I had been completely wiped out. I did not confront him. Confrontation without leverage is simply a warning, and I had no intention of warning my son the hunt had begun. I drove away from my neighborhood and parked in the empty lot of a desolate strip mall. The rain battered the roof as I rehearsed my next move. I pulled out my phone and dialed Derek's number. It rang 3 times before he answered, his voice breathless. I slumped my shoulders, forcing my body to mimic the posture of a defeated old man, allowing that weakness to bleed into my vocal cords. I told him the stress of the funeral, combined with the revelation of his mother's secret real estate, had pushed my fragile heart to the breaking point. I let my voice crack as I explained I had booked a flight to a secluded grief counseling retreat in southern Florida. I told him I would be gone for 10 days, disconnected from the world with no cellular service. I begged him to handle the Penthouse mess and the probate lawyers in my absence. The heavy sigh of profound relief that escaped Derek's lips was unmistakable. He quickly masked it with fabricated concern, promising he would protect my interests while I rested. I thanked my devoted son, ended the call, and powered down the mobile device. I did not go to the airport. I was not flying to Florida. I drove to a mundane car rental agency on the outskirts of the city and paid cash for an unremarkable gray sedan that would blend seamlessly into any urban environment. I left my personal vehicle parked in a secure storage facility. Next, I made a call from a prepaid burner phone to a man named Gregory. Gregory was a former federal investigator, a brilliant forensic accountant, who had previously consulted for my firm a decade ago. We met an hour later in a dimly lit diner away from the financial district. I slid a heavily encrypted thumb drive across the sticky laminate table containing the digital remnants of my completely drained $8 million retirement portfolio. I told Gregory my life savings had been systematically siphoned out over the last 24 months through forged signatures, and I needed to know exactly where every single penny had landed. Gregory took the drive, his professional demeanor hardening as he listened to the sheer magnitude of the theft. He promised me a tracking report within 48 hours. Before leaving, I handed him a thick envelope of cash and asked for one specific favor. I needed high-grade microscopic surveillance equipment, the kind that could not be detected by commercial sweeping devices. Gregory delivered a heavy duffel bag to my motel room 3 hours later. I waited until 2. The Seattle skyline was swallowed by thick fog and heavy rain, providing the perfect cover for a ghost. I drove the rented sedan into the underground parking garage of the luxury high-rise using the electronic key fob to bypass the security gates. The building was dead quiet. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor, my heart beating a slow, methodical rhythm. I was no longer a grieving husband or a confused father. I was an engineer returning to a compromised structural site, carrying a duffel bag filled with motion-activated cameras and highly sensitive audio bugs. I swiped the fob and slipped silently into the dark, ruined penthouse. The air was stale, smelling of spilled whiskey and plaster dust. I strapped a small tactical flashlight to my chest and went to work. My experience in structural engineering made this part effortless. I knew exactly how luxury high-rise ventilation systems were routed. I unscrewed the metal grates of the HVAC ducts, reaching deep into the walls to place the microscopic lenses where they would have an unobstructed panoramic view of the living room, the kitchen, and the main hallway. The devices were entirely wireless, designed to transmit encrypted live feeds directly to my secure laptop the moment any motion or sound was detected. I moved through the shadows with silent precision, planting audio receivers beneath the heavy dining table and inside the hollow base of a decorative marble column. Every corner of the penthouse was now my personal interrogation room. My final target was the master bedroom suite at the end of the long corridor. I pushed the door open, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. This room had also been subjected to a frantic search, though slightly less destructive than the living area. The mattress was askew, the bedding stripped and thrown into a corner. The massive walk-in closet had been entirely ransacked, expensive clothing pulled from their hangers and dumped onto the plush carpet. I walked toward the center of the room, scanning the architecture. My eyes caught a slight, unnatural elevation in the heavy Persian rug, positioned near the foot of the king-sized bed. I set my canvas duffel bag down and grabbed the embroidered edge of the heavy rug, pulling it back forcefully to expose the dark hardwood flooring hidden beneath the fabric. Embedded flush into the solid floorboards was a heavy industrial-grade steel safe. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I dropped to my knees, shining the bright light directly onto the cold metal surface. The heavy steel door had not simply been opened with a combination code. It had been brutally and violently compromised. The digital keypad was smashed into jagged plastic pieces, and the locking bolts had been severed by a high-temperature cutting torch, leaving scorched burn marks across the wood flooring. Someone had gone to extreme lengths to force their way into this vault. I grabbed the metallic handle and pulled the steel door open. The damaged hinges groaned loudly in the quiet room. I aimed the flashlight deep inside the dark cavity. It was empty. Whatever asset Martha had hidden inside this floor safe had already been extracted. The violent desperation I had witnessed earlier suddenly made perfect sense. Derek and his companion had definitely not torched this safe. They had arrived here this morning fully expecting to find something specific, only to discover in absolute horror that someone else had completely beaten them to the prize. I leaned closer, carefully examining the scorched interior of the metal box. Pushed deep into the back right corner, likely forgotten, in the frantic adrenaline-fueled rush of whoever had emptied the vault, was a tiny, crumpled piece of white paper. I reached inside with a trembling hand and pinched the scrap of paper between my fingers. I pulled it out into the bright beam of the flashlight, gently smoothing out the wrinkled, torn edges against my knee. It was a printed receipt from a specialized technology retailer based in downtown Seattle. The ink was slightly faded from the intense heat of the cutting torch, but the bold black text was still entirely legible. The receipt documented the expensive purchase of a single, highly specific item. It was a ledger, a military-grade encrypted hardware wallet designed exclusively for the secure, completely offline storage of massive amounts of untraceable cryptocurrency. I rented a room in a dilapidated roadside motel on the outskirts of Seattle. The carpet smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach, a jarring contrast to the pristine hardwood floors of the $4 million penthouse my stolen money had purchased. I sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, watching Gregory work. The former federal investigator had transformed the cheap laminate desk into a highly sophisticated digital forensics laboratory. Multiple encrypted laptops hummed softly, their screens casting a harsh, pale blue light across the dark room. For 2 exhausting days, we barely slept. We subsisted on bitter black coffee and stale vending machine sandwiches, meticulously tracing the complex financial labyrinth my wife had secretly constructed. Gregory was a master of his craft. He bypassed the banking firewalls and peeled back the layers of deception with cold, mechanical efficiency. Every time his fingers danced across the keyboard, another piece of my 40-year marriage was irrevocably shattered. I watched the digital trail unfold before my eyes, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. The first devastating blow came when Gregory uncovered the exact mechanism of the theft. Martha had not simply guessed my passwords or transferred small amounts over time. She had executed a complete hostile takeover of my entire financial existence. Gregory pulled up a scanned legal document on his monitor. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney seemingly notarized and filed with the state. It granted Martha absolute uncontested authority to liquidate my retirement portfolios, access my private trusts, and transfer unlimited funds without triggering any secondary verification protocols from the bank. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my chest tightening with a sickening dread. I stared at the signature line at the bottom of the page. The sweeping, authoritative strokes of the ink perfectly mimicked my handwriting. It was a flawless forgery. The woman who had kissed me goodnight for over 4 decades, the woman who had packed my lunches and raised our children, had sat at a desk and deliberately, calculatingly practiced forging my signature until she could seamlessly steal my life savings. But the most pressing question remained unanswered. Where had $8 million gone? Gregory ran the complex routing numbers through his specialized tracking software. The funds had initially been wired into a series of anonymous offshore cryptocurrency exchanges, completely washing the money of its original source. From there, the digital currency was funneled into a massive, highly encrypted cold storage wallet. It was the exact hardware device I had found the scorched receipt for inside the ruined floor safe. However, Gregory discovered a secondary underlying current in the data stream. Not all the money had stayed in the digital wallet. Massive, sustained injections of capital had been routinely diverted back into the traditional banking system. These funds were meticulously disguised as venture capital investments and anonymous angel investor grants. Gregory tracked the destination of these massive cash infusions. They were all systematically channeled into a single, rapidly sinking corporate entity based in Silicon Valley. It was a tech startup that had launched 3 years ago with massive industry hype, only to quietly begin bleeding millions of dollars in undisclosed operational losses. Gregory pulled up the corporate registry for the failing company. The screen displayed the executive leadership board. My breath caught sharply in my throat, choking the air from my lungs. Staring back at me from the glowing monitor, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, with a confident, arrogant smile, was the chief executive officer of the fraudulent startup. It was Derek, my son. The loyal, grieving son who had held my hand at the cemetery. The same man who had knelt in the ruined penthouse, pretending to desperately search for a deed to protect me from the probate court. The entire narrative I had constructed over the last 3 days instantly collapsed, replaced by a truth so profoundly dark it made my blood run cold. Martha did not steal my retirement fund to finance a lavish, secret double life. She did not drain my accounts to run away with a hidden lover. She committed a massive federal financial crime to bail out our golden child. Derek's technology company had been quietly going bankrupt. Instead of facing his catastrophic failures like a man, he had turned to his mother. And Martha, completely blinded by her obsessive devotion to her son, had chosen to sacrifice me to save him. She had willingly destroyed my secure future, cut off the vital mortgage payments keeping my daughter Sarah from foreclosure, and illegally embezzled $8 million just to keep Derek's sinking ship afloat. She had bought the luxury penthouse not as a retirement gift for me, but as a secret corporate asset to hide the laundered money. The sheer calculated cruelty of their conspiracy was paralyzing. I had spent my life pouring a solid concrete foundation for my family, and my wife and son had colluded to place dynamite at the very base of those pillars. I sat back on the sagging motel bed, burying my face in my trembling hands. The crushing weight of the absolute betrayal pressed down on my shoulders, threatening to shatter my sanity. My son was not a victim of circumstance. He was the primary architect of my financial ruin. He had used his mother as a willing accomplice, and when she suddenly died in that tragic car crash, his meticulously constructed scheme had instantly derailed. The missing encrypted wallet, the violent destruction of the penthouse, the bruised and bleeding knuckles, it all finally made perfect, horrifying sense. He was not grieving. He was utterly terrified because the stolen millions were locked away, and the only person who knew the location of the digital key was buried 6 feet under the damp Seattle earth. I closed my eyes, trying to force my erratic heartbeat into a steady, manageable rhythm. The silence of the dingy motel room was profound, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain against the thin window pane and the low, steady hum of Gregory's powerful computers. I needed to formulate a plan. I needed to secure the remaining assets and orchestrate a response that would completely dismantle Derek's arrogant illusions. But before I could speak, a sharp, piercing chime shattered the quiet atmosphere of the room. It was not a text message. It was the highly specific, urgent notification tone from the secure burner phone resting on the laminate desk. I lunged forward, grabbing the device with shaking fingers. The screen glowed brightly, displaying a high-priority security alert. The microscopic motion activated surveillance cameras I had painstakingly installed deep inside the air vents of the luxury penthouse had just been tripped. Someone had breached the perimeter. I quickly tapped the screen, instantly opening the encrypted high-definition live video feed. The digital image stabilized, revealing a clear, panoramic view of the ruined living room. The heavy oak door swung shut. 2 figures stood amidst the shredded leather and smashed crystal. It was Derek. And standing right beside him, her arm still wrapped tightly in a white medical cast, was his wife, Monica. They were screaming at each other. The volume peaked. I grabbed the headphones resting on the motel desk and jammed them over my ears. The audio feed crackled to life, transmitting the sharp, echoing acoustics of the ruined penthouse directly into my head. I watched the screen, my breath shallow and ragged. My son and my daughter-in-law stood amidst the shredded remnants of the living room. Derek looked like a man standing on the edge of a sheer cliff, his posture crumbling under an invisible, crushing weight. Monica, despite the cast wrapping her left forearm, projected an aura of absolute, terrifying dominance. Her face was contorted with a dark, vicious fury that completely erased the grieving widow facade she had performed at the cemetery. The hidden microphones caught the ragged sound of Derek breathing. He raised his hands desperately, trying to pacify his wife, pleading with her to keep her voice down. He warned her that the neighbors might hear them, that the building security might dispatch an elevator. His cowardice was palpable, bleeding through the digital transmission. Monica did not lower her voice. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. With a sudden explosive burst of violence, she swung her uninjured right hand and slapped Derek directly across the face. The sharp crack of her palm striking his cheek echoed through my headphones. Derek staggered backwards, stumbling over a torn leather cushion, his hand flying up to cover his reddening skin. "You promised me you would find the ledger, Derek," Monica hissed, her voice vibrating with a lethal, barely contained rage. "You dragged me to that graveyard, you made me play the heartbroken survivor in front of your clueless father, and you promised me that the moment the dirt covered her coffin, you would secure the money. Where is it? Where is the $12 million? My blood ran cold. $12 million. The scale of the theft was staggering. Gregory had traced $8 million from my retirement accounts, but Derek and Martha had somehow amassed even more, likely funneling venture capital investments from his failing tech company directly into that digital vault. And Monica knew about every single penny. She was not a peripheral bystander. She was a fully informed participant in the wholesale slaughter of my family's financial foundation. Derek cowered before his wife, a shell of the confident executive I had raised. He stammered loudly, his voice thick with a sickening mixture of fear and desperation. He swore to her that he had torn the penthouse apart. He pointed at the gutted sofas, the smashed artwork, and the ruined drywall. He told her that he and Damien had used a cutting torch on the hidden floor safe, but the vault was empty. He pleaded with her to believe him, insisting that his mother must have painted the wallet before the accident, hiding it from him. "Do not lie to me," Monica sneered, stepping over a vase. "Your mother was devoted to you. She stole your father blind just to keep you out of federal prison. She would never hide the money from her golden boy. You have it, and you are trying to cut me out of my rightful share." Derek dropped to his knees amidst the plaster dust, grabbing the hem of Monica's coat. He begged her to understand his panic. He swore on his life that he did not have the device. He cried that if he could not access the cryptocurrency, his startup would default. The federal investigators would audit the shell companies, and he would spend the rest of his life locked inside a concrete cell. I watched my son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, weeping on the floor of an expensive apartment like a cornered rat. The disgust I felt in that moment entirely eclipsed any paternal love. Before Monica could deliver another brutal strike, the doors of the master bedroom swung open. A third figure walked casually into the frame of the camera. It was Damien. The young man was still wearing the expensive dark silk lounging robe with the silver monogram. He moved with a relaxed, arrogant grace that defied the tension of the ruined room. He walked over to the bar cart, stepping carelessly over the debris, and calmly poured himself a glass of amber whiskey. He took a slow sip, his eyes fixed on Monica with an expression of amusement. Damien leaned against the marble counter, swirling the liquid in his glass. He told Monica she needed to calm down. He suggested her aggressive, hysterical shouting was counterproductive to their shared financial goals. He spoke to her not as a real estate broker trying to mediate a marital dispute, but as an equal, a partner who held a stake in the stolen fortune. Monica turned her head away from her kneeling husband. She locked her eyes onto Damien. The loathing radiating from her face was terrifying. She took a step toward the bar cart. The silence in the penthouse stretched out, suffocating, transmitting a lethal tension through my headphones. "Tell your boyfriend to back off, Derek," Monica commanded, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the digital feed. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed the headphones tighter against my ears, refusing to believe the words I had heard. Boyfriend. The monogrammed silk robe. The initials D and D. The comfort Damien displayed while drinking whiskey in the middle of a trashed penthouse. Damien was never Martha's secret lover. He was Derek's. My son had been living a double life, financing a clandestine romantic relationship with embezzled millions while maintaining a marriage to Monica. The depth of the deception was dizzying. Derek scrambled to his feet, holding his hands out in a desperate gesture. He begged Monica to leave Damien out of the argument. He insisted Damien was just trying to help them navigate the crisis. But Monica did not break her lethal gaze. She stepped closer to the man in the silk robe, her uninjured hand balling into a tight fist. Her knuckles turned perfectly white with the intense pressure, completely ignoring the painful cast wrapped around her healing forearm. "I am not going to warn you again, Derek." Monica continued, her tone vibrating with a sinister, absolute finality. "You will tell your pathetic lover to shut his mouth. You will tear up these floorboards with your bare hands if you have to. You will find that encrypted digital wallet, and you will transfer $6 million into my private account by tomorrow morning." Derek swallowed hard, his voice trembling with a pathetic whine. His eyes darted frantically between his furious wife and his incredibly calm lover trapped between two terrible forces. He argued that the funds were securely locked away, that he needed more time to track his mother's final movements. He begged her to understand the catastrophic reality of their situation. Monica tilted her head, a cold, predatory smile spreading across her face. "If you do not find my money by tomorrow morning, Derek, I swear to God I will just go to the police, and I will tell them exactly what happened in that car with your mother." My blood ran ice cold. The harsh words echoed through the cheap plastic headphones, freezing the air in my lungs. Monica's threat hung in the ruined penthouse, heavy and lethal. I sat perfectly still in the dimly lit motel room, my hands gripping the edge of the laminate desk so tightly my joints ached. I could hear the rapid, shallow sound of Derek breathing on the live audio feed. He was completely cornered. The fragile facade of his life was fracturing under the immense weight of his own lies. Derek's voice cracked when he finally responded. He begged her to lower her voice, terrified the neighbors might hear the word police. He stumbled backward, moving away from Monica, and practically fell into Damien. The man in the dark silk lounging robe did not push him away. Instead, Damien reached out with striking familiarity. He placed a stabilizing hand directly on the small of Derek's back. It was a gesture of profound intimacy. It was the kind of touch reserved entirely for a long-term partner, possessing a casual comfort that takes years to develop. Monica watched the physical exchange, a look of profound disgust washing over her face. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh that cut through the tension. She mocked her husband, asking him if he needed his boyfriend to hold his hand while he figured out how to clean up the monumental mess he had created. The confirmation hit me like a physical blow. The monogrammed silk robe, the relaxed demeanor, the secret penthouse. Damien was never Martha's lover. The sprawling deception had been completely misread by my desperate mind. Damien was Derek's secret lover. My son had been living a clandestine double life right beneath our noses. He had been balancing a fake marriage to Monica while maintaining an extravagant relationship with the young man standing beside him. Damien took a slow sip of his whiskey, his arrogant expression undisturbed by Monica's venomous glare. He told Monica she needed to control her emotional outbursts. He calmly explained that pointing fingers would not magically manifest the missing $12 million. Damien casually leaned against the shattered bar cart and reminded her that this entire operation was incredibly delicate. He said Derek had been working relentlessly for 3 years to keep his failing technology startup afloat, and draining the old man's retirement funds was the only viable method to prevent a massive federal bankruptcy investigation. I closed my eyes, the bitter truth burning in my chest. The tech startup was nothing but a colossal financial black hole. Derek had been deliberately embezzling millions from my accounts to simultaneously cover his corporate debts and finance his incredibly lavish lifestyle with Damien. He was siphoning my life savings to buy expensive sports cars, book flights, and maintain this $4 million downtown sanctuary. But a horrifying question still remained. If Derek was the ultimate beneficiary of the stolen money, how had my wife been involved? Why was the fraudulent power of attorney legally tied to Martha? The answer arrived a moment later, delivered through the digital audio feed with devastating cruelty. Monica stepped toward Damien, her voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. She told the young man he had absolutely no right to speak about the money. She reminded Damien that he was nothing but a parasite living off the stolen charity of a dead woman. Monica looked back at her husband and spat out the truth. She reminded Derek that if his mother had not caught him in bed with Damien 2 years ago, none of this would have ever happened. The revelation struck me with blinding force. Martha had known. My wife had not been in the dark about our son's double life. She had discovered his secret affair and his collapsing business empire. But instead of coming to me, instead of sitting down with her husband of 40 years to honestly confront the catastrophic failure of our son, she had made a completely different choice. Martha chose to protect her golden boy at all costs. She chose to shield Derek from the public shame of a failed marriage and a hidden lifestyle. To maintain the flawless illusion of her perfect son, my wife willingly sacrificed my entire existence. Damien chuckled darkly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He taunted Monica, noting that Martha was far more devoted to Derek's happiness than Monica ever was. He reminded the furious woman that Martha had gladly forged my signature. My wife had sat at my mahogany desk practicing my handwriting, crossing every legal boundary to drain my $8 million retirement portfolio. Martha had set up the shell company in her own name, taking on the legal risk to purchase this luxury penthouse so Derek and Damien would have a safe place to conduct their affair away from Monica's prying eyes. My wife had not betrayed me for her own romantic passion. She had betrayed me to facilitate the manipulative greed of our own son. Derek finally found his voice stepping away from Damien to face his wife. He demanded she stop disrespecting his mother. He yelled that Martha was the only person who truly understood the immense pressure he was under. He claimed his mother was just trying to secure his future before I wasted the family fortune. Derek's voice grew louder, shedding the pathetic tone from moments earlier, replaced by a sudden, sickening arrogance. He paced across the ruined living room, his expensive shoes crunching over the broken crystal. He told Monica that my money was practically his anyway. He said he was taking his rightful inheritance early. He complained bitterly about my strict expectations, whining about how I made him work for every promotion while he built a tech empire. Then he delivered a sentence that extinguished the final spark of paternal love in my heart. Derek looked directly at the hidden vent where my microphone was silently recording. He told Monica I was nothing but a senile cash cow, an outdated workaholic, who did not realize his savings had been vaporized over the last 24 months. He said I was too blind, too trusting, and too old to ever figure out the cryptocurrency network they had utilized to hide the stolen wealth. I sat in the dim motel room, the digital audio feeding the destruction of my family into my ears. My breathing slowed, becoming deep and methodical. The crushing grief that had weighed me down since the funeral was gone. It was replaced by crystalline clarity. Martha had not been a victim. She was the primary enabler of my ruin. Derek was not a struggling businessman. He was a remorseless predator who viewed his father as a disposable bank account. They had colluded to dismantle my life, assuming I would fade away into quiet obscurity. But they had gravely underestimated the man they were dealing with. I was a highly experienced structural engineer. I knew exactly how to calculate load-bearing weights, and I knew exactly how to trigger a controlled demolition. I adjusted the volume dial on my receiver, ready to quietly listen to the rest of the dark secrets currently echoing through the ruined penthouse. The digital audio feed crackled sharply, with the sudden sound of scuffling footwear, snapping my attention back to the brutal reality unfolding inside the ruined penthouse. Through the headphones pressing against my ears, I heard a heavy, violent thud. Monica had lunged forward physically, shoving my son backward until his spine slammed hard against the plastered drywall. The impact violently rattled the microscopic microphone hidden nearby. Damien let out a low whistle from his position near the shattered bar cart, clearly amused by the escalation of domestic violence. Yet the young man made no move to intervene. Derek gasped for air, his voice pathetic and incredibly weak as he begged his furious wife to release her tight grip on his shirt collar. He pleaded with her to be reasonable, frantically insisting they were all navigating the same treacherous waters, and that turning against each other would only guarantee they all ended up wearing federal prison uniforms. Monica let out a chilling, humorless laugh that echoed ominously through the empty hallway. She told Derek he was a delusional coward if he genuinely thought they were equal partners in this financial slaughter. She leaned in close to his face, her voice dropping to a low hiss that the highly sensitive audio bugs captured with terrifying clarity. She told him he was nothing but a pathetic stepping stone, a temporary inconvenience she had been forced to tolerate while patiently waiting for the perfect moment to extract her rightful payout. My heart hammered violently against my aching ribs as I listened to her completely dismantle the fragile illusion of their marriage. Monica tightened her fierce grip on Derek, her tone dripping with absolute unfiltered contempt. She demanded to know if Derek honestly believed she was completely blind to his clandestine lifestyle. She asked him if he truly thought she had not noticed the millions of dollars systematically draining from his supposed technology startup, or the exorbitant hotel charges appearing on hidden statements, or the late-night text messages he constantly exchanged with Damien while lying right next to her in their marital bed. Derek stammered loudly, his desperate words stumbling over each other as he tried to construct a frantic denial, but Monica swiftly cut him off. She proudly declared she had known about the secret romantic affair and the massive corporate embezzlement for well over a full year. She had quietly hired a ruthless private investigator to track his daily movements, compiling a massive, undeniably damning dossier of his spectacular personal and professional failures. She had recognized a much more lucrative opportunity when she discovered that my $8 million retirement portfolio had been completely liquidated and converted into untraceable cryptocurrency. She had bided her time watching him and Martha execute the colossal theft, patiently waiting for the digital wallet to be fully funded before launching her ultimate extortion strategy. I sat completely paralyzed in the dim motel room, my trembling hands gripping the edge of the cheap laminate desk as Monica revealed the true, horrifying depth of her calculated malice. She told Derek that she had finally decided to make her aggressive move exactly 3 days ago on the precise afternoon of the fatal car crash. My breath caught sharply in my aching chest. Monica had generously offered to drive Martha to a scheduled botanical convention in the distant suburbs, deliberately using the pouring Seattle rain and the isolated highway as the perfect, secure environment for a high-stakes private negotiation. The very moment they merged onto the remote stretch of the interstate surrounded by towering evergreen trees and slick asphalt, Monica had calmly presented her non-negotiable demands. She explicitly told my wife that she possessed hard copies of the forged banking documents, undeniable photographic evidence of Derek's secret romance with Damien, and a complete financial map of the stolen cryptocurrency routing network. She threatened to hand the entire destructive dossier directly to me, the federal tax authorities, and the corporate press, unless Martha immediately transferred $6 million into a secure offshore account. Derek let out a horrified gasp on the audio feed, asking what his mother had done in response. Monica sneered loudly, her profound disgust bleeding through the digital transmission. She told him Martha had reacted exactly like a cornered rabid animal, desperately trying to protect her precious golden boy. My wife had refused to surrender a single penny of the stolen fortune. Instead of negotiating to protect her son, Martha had completely lost her temper, consumed by a protective rage. Monica described in chilling detail how Martha began screaming frantically, threatening to destroy Monica if she dared to expose Derek's hidden double life. The heated verbal argument escalated into a terrifying physical altercation inside the speeding vehicle. Monica coldly detailed how Martha had lunged across the center console, her hands clawing at Monica's face and arms in a desperate bid to grab the physical blackmail documents resting openly on the passenger seat. The steering wheel jerked violently under the sudden physical assault. The heavy sedan immediately began to hydroplane on the slick, rain-soaked asphalt. Monica admitted, her voice devoid of any human empathy, that instead of slamming on the brakes to regain control, she had yanked the steering wheel hard to the right. She had sent the speeding vehicle spinning completely out of control, directly toward the concrete highway barrier. She had braced her own body for the impact, ensuring the passenger side absorbed the absolute maximum lethal force of the collision. Martha was killed instantly upon impact, her body crushed by the weight of her own desperate lies. When the paramedics arrived at the bloody scene, Monica wept crocodile tears, lying to the officers that my wife had suffered a sudden heart attack and slumped heavily over the wheel. A sickening wave of nausea washed over me, chilling my blood down to absolute zero. The tragic accident that had shattered my world 3 days ago was a calculated murder. My wife had died brutally trying to protect a stolen, untraceable fortune, killed by a greedy, ruthless daughter-in-law, completely willing to execute anyone standing firmly between her and a massive multi-million-dollar payout. I listened in silent horror as Monica shoved Derek hard against the damaged drywall one final time, her voice rising to the sharp, commanding crescendo. She told him she had already eliminated the primary obstacle in her path, and she was prepared to legally or physically eliminate him next. She demanded he hand over the encrypted digital wallet immediately. She warned him that if he refused to surrender the $12 million right now, she would march straight into the police precinct tomorrow morning and present a fabricated trail of evidence proving Derek had orchestrated the deadly crash to silence his mother and steal the inheritance for himself and his secret lover. Derek let out a raw, agonizing scream of terror that tore through my headphones. He dropped heavily to his knees amidst the scattered white plaster, burying his face deep in his trembling hands. He shrieked, his voice echoing across the ruined penthouse, swearing blindly that his mother had hidden the physical ledger days before she died, and he had no idea where she had buried the digital key. I reached up with trembling fingers and tore the plastic headphones from my ears. The frantic sound of my son sobbing in the ruined penthouse was instantly severed, replaced by the heavy silence of the motel room. I tossed the headset onto the desk, my hands shaking so violently I had to press my palms against the cold surface to steady myself. A sudden violent wave of nausea washed over me. I leaned forward, squeezing my eyes shut, overwhelmed by the toxic magnitude of the revelations. My mind struggled to process the horrific reality of the situation. The 40 years I had spent sacrificing my happiness to build a secure fortress for my family had been nothing but an elaborate, devastating illusion. I took a deep, ragged breath, forcing oxygen into my burning lungs. As I slowly exhaled, a profound psychological shift occurred deep within my chest. The paralyzing grief that had suffocated me since the day of the car crash simply evaporated. It burned away, consumed entirely by a cold, calculating, and absolute rage. The tears I had shed for my dead wife dried up instantly. Martha was not a tragic victim of a slick, rain-soaked highway. She was a remorseless traitor who willingly bankrupted her husband to finance a criminal enterprise. Derek was not a grieving, overwhelmed son trying to navigate a profound loss. He was a parasitic thief who manipulated his mother into destroying my retirement. And Monica was not a traumatized survivor. She was a vicious, calculating extortionist and a cold-blooded murderer. They had looked me in the eyes at the cemetery, weeping manufactured tears over the grave of the woman they conspired to destroy. I finally opened my exhausted eyes, the sudden icy fury sharpening my blurred vision with absolute crystalline clarity. Derek's frantic, desperate scream echoed repeatedly in my mind. He had sworn his mother hid the physical ledger days before she died, leaving him entirely blind to the location of the digital key. I stood up from the bed and began to pace the narrow room. My analytical brain, trained over decades of complex structural engineering, began to dissect the timeline of the fatal collision. If Martha knew she was being hunted by a ruthless daughter-in-law possessing blackmail material, she would never leave the wallet in the penthouse. She would not trust a hidden safe knowing Derek had the combination and was completely compromised. Martha was a highly intelligent woman fighting a desperate battle for her son's survival. She would have kept the most valuable asset exactly where she could constantly monitor it. She would have kept it physically attached to her own body. The realization struck me with the sudden blinding force of a lightning bolt. I stopped pacing, my boots planted firmly on the stained carpet. I remembered the dreary rain-swept morning of the funeral service. Before driving to the cemetery, I stopped at the coroner's office to sign release paperwork. The medical examiner offered condolences and handed me a sealed plastic evidence bag containing Martha's personal effects. The bag held her wedding band, a wristwatch, and a piece of jewelry she had worn constantly over the last 2 months. It was a bulky, incredibly ugly silver pendant suspended on a thick, reinforced chain. When she purchased it, I commented on how heavy and unrefined it looked compared to her usual taste. She snapped defensively, claiming it was an artisanal piece acquired during a wellness retreat, and she flatly refused to ever take it off. She wore it in the shower to sleep, and she was wearing it when the massive impact ended her life. I spun around and practically dove toward the small closet where I had stored my nylon travel suitcase. I unzipped the main compartment with frantic, clumsy fingers, throwing my folded shirts and shaving kit onto the floor. Buried at the bottom, tucked inside a dark velvet pouch I intended to lock in a deposit box, was the plastic evidence bag provided by the coroner. I pulled it out, carrying it over to the bright light of the laminate desk. Through the crinkling plastic, I could see the tarnished wedding ring I slipped onto her finger 40 years ago. Resting right beside it was the heavy, cumbersome silver pendant. I ripped the plastic seal open and dumped the items onto the desk. I carefully picked up the heavy, bulky silver necklace from the scattered debris. The metal was surprisingly dense, perfectly rectangular, and abnormally thick for a decorative piece. I ran my thumb along the smooth, polished edges, searching for a seam. My engineering instincts immediately recognized the subtle hairline fracture running along the lateral side of the casing. It was not a solid piece of molded metal. It was a custom-fabricated hollow housing unit. I frantically searched the room for a tool, finally grabbing a heavy steel wrench I had left in my canvas supply bag after outfitting the luxury penthouse. I placed the pendant flat on the sturdy laminate surface, gripping the wrench handle with white-knuckled intensity. I raised my arm and brought the heavy tool down in a swift, violent arc. The sharp crack of metal striking metal resonated loudly through the cheap motel walls. The silver casing shattered instantly, the custom locking mechanism violently buckling under the intense physical force. The pendant split cleanly in half, the 2 ruined metallic pieces sliding across the smooth surface of the desk. Resting perfectly preserved inside the hollow cavity of the broken jewelry was a small, matte black device. I dropped the steel wrench, my breath hitching painfully in the back of my throat. I reached down and picked up the device with a trembling hand. It was exactly what the scorched receipt had described. It was a military-grade micro-USB cryptocurrency ledger. I sat down heavily in the desk chair, my heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against my chest. Gregory had already installed the necessary decryption and blockchain verification software on my secure laptop during our exhaustive financial tracing session. I powered on the computer, waiting an agonizing 10 seconds for the encrypted operating system to load. With meticulous, deliberate care, I plugged the small black device directly into the USB port. The software instantly recognized the hardware wallet, running a rapid diagnostic authentication. I held my breath as the digital loading bar moved across the glowing screen, verifying the highly complex blockchain credentials securely stored deep within the tiny silicon microchip. The screen flashed bright green, bypassing the final security protocol. The comprehensive financial dashboard populated, displaying the exact real-time balance of the offshore crypto account, $12,500,000. I stared at the impossible number, the cold, brilliant glow of the monitor illuminating my face in the dark motel room. My traitorous wife was dead. My arrogant, thieving son was now completely cornered. My ruthless, murderous daughter-in-law was desperate, and I now held their entire world right in the palm of my hand. I would not simply take my stolen money back and quietly walk away into the shadows. I would systematically demolish every single lie they had built. I stared at the glowing green numbers on the laptop screen, the $12.5 million illuminating the dark motel room. I knew that if I simply called the police right now, the situation would instantly dissolve into a chaotic, protracted legal nightmare. Derek and Monica would hire expensive defense attorneys. They would point fingers at each other or destroy digital evidence and spin an endless web of plausible deniability. They would claim Martha had acted entirely alone, or that the massive funds were part of a legitimate corporate investment strategy that failed. I could not allow them to hide behind the sluggish bureaucracy of the justice system, dragging the process out for years while my daughter Sarah lost her home. I needed them completely isolated. I needed them stripped of their carefully constructed masks, trapped in a room together, where their overwhelming greed would force them to expose their own catastrophic crimes. I needed a controlled environment to execute a perfect structural demolition of their lives. My first priority was securing the stolen capital. I could not leave the cryptocurrency on this physical device. If anything happened to me, or if Derek somehow managed to overpower me and seize the ledger, the fortune would be lost forever. I picked up the secure burner phone and called Gregory. He answered on the first ring. I told him I had recovered the digital wallet and needed to immediately route the entire balance into an impenetrable financial fortress. Gregory walked me through the complex, highly encrypted transfer process. We established an irrevocable offshore trust, legally impenetrable and entirely immune to any domestic probate claims or corporate bankruptcy seizures. I designated my daughter Sarah as the sole immediate beneficiary. She was the only person in my family who possessed a genuine heart, the only one currently drowning in a foreclosure directly caused by her mother and brother. I typed in the routing coordinates, verifying the digital addresses 3 separate times to ensure absolute precision. I took a deep breath and hit the execute command. The screen loaded for several agonizing seconds. Then the confirmation message appeared. $12,500,000 vanished from the hardware wallet, instantly securing my daughter's future. The balance on the small black device reset to exactly 0. The ledger was now nothing but an empty, worthless piece of plastic and silicone. I leaned back in the creaking motel chair, letting out a long, heavy exhale. For the first time since I stood in that rainy cemetery, a profound sense of genuine relief washed over my tired bones. My daughter and her family were safe. They would never have to worry about a bank foreclosure or a missed mortgage payment ever again. The toxic financial leverage my son and my wife had ruthlessly wielded was completely neutralized. I safely ejected the empty device from the laptop and placed it in my jacket pocket. It was time to set the bait. I picked up my mobile phone and dialed Derek's number. As the line rang, I closed my eyes and focused on slowing my breathing, deliberately restricting the airflow to my lungs to make my voice sound incredibly weak and fragile. When Derek answered, I let out a long, ragged cough. I told him I had flown back from the Florida grief retreat early. I said the intense humidity and the overwhelming sorrow were simply too much for my failing heart to endure. I forced my voice to tremble, projecting the pathetic image of a dying old man desperately seeking final peace. I told him I had gone to his mother's secret penthouse to collect some of her personal belongings and had stumbled upon a hidden file containing all the corporate ownership documents. I said I was terrified of dying before the complicated estate was settled. I begged him, Monica and his broker friend Damien, to meet me at the luxury apartment tonight. I claimed I wanted to sign the entire property and all my remaining liquid assets completely over to him before I passed away. The silence on the other end of the line was incredibly brief, but I could practically hear the greedy, triumphant gears turning rapidly in my son's head. Derek's voice suddenly flooded with manufactured concern, poorly masking his absolute elation. He eagerly agreed to gather everyone and meet me at the Penthouse by 8 o'clock tonight. He promised to take care of everything, urging me to just sit down and rest. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. The pathetic, dying old man vanished instantly, replaced by a veteran structural engineer preparing a reinforced containment zone. I refused to let them control the narrative any longer. I grabbed my heavy winter coat and drove the rented sedan to a massive industrial hardware supply store on the outer edge of the city. The rain continued to fall in heavy gray sheets as I walked methodically through the brightly lit aisles, listening to the monotonous hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. I bypassed the standard residential locks and moved directly to the commercial-grade security section, scanning the shelves for maximum durability. I selected a long length of thick forged steel chain, the exact kind utilized to secure heavy construction equipment on remote building sites against severe weather conditions. I added 3 solid titanium padlocks to my shopping cart, along with a high-powered cordless impact drill and several heavy-duty deadbolt mechanisms designed to withstand immense physical trauma. I paid for the materials in cash, completely ignoring the curious glance of the young cashier as she scanned the heavy, menacing metallic items. I drove back to the financial district, slipping into the underground parking garage unnoticed. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor and entered the ruined penthouse. The air inside was thick and heavy, charged with the lingering tension of the violent argument I had recorded earlier today. I set my canvas bag of heavy hardware on the kitchen counter and went directly to work. I knew exactly how to manipulate load-bearing frames and secure entry points against massive external force. I reinforced the hinges on the heavy oak door with thick 3-inch steel screws, driving them deep into the solid wall studs to prevent any structural weakness. I bored deep holes directly into the door frame, installing the commercial deadbolts perfectly flush with the surrounding wood to prevent any external tampering. I tested the locking mechanisms repeatedly, ensuring the heavy steel cylinders slid perfectly into their reinforced metal housings without the slightest sound of friction. I gathered the excess wood shavings and swept them into a small pile, leaving the entryway looking entirely undisturbed to the untrained eye. My hands moved with a practiced mechanical rhythm completely devoid of any hesitation or lingering paternal doubt. Finally, I wrapped the thick forged steel chain heavily through the primary interior handles, ensuring that once the solid titanium padlocks were snapped shut, no amount of desperate human strength could possibly force the door open from the inside. I stood back, wiping a thin layer of sweat from my forehead, admiring my architectural handiwork. The trap was perfectly set. The bait was resting comfortably in my pocket. The structural integrity of the cage was absolute. Now all I had to do was wait in the darkness for the rats to eagerly walk inside and completely seal their own devastating fate. A fierce Pacific Northwest thunderstorm finally broke over the sprawling city just after sunset, bringing a bitter chill. Heavy rain lashed violently against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the luxury penthouse, the relentless downpour mirroring the dark, turbulent storm raging inside my own chest. I sat perfectly still in a high-backed leather armchair, positioned in the deepest shadows of the ruined living room. The massive apartment was dark, save for the erratic flashes of blue lightning illuminating the shredded furniture and the sharp, jagged shards of broken crystal scattered across the hardwood floors. Resting on the low-glass coffee table directly in front of me was the small, matte black cryptocurrency ledger. It sat there like a silent, unassuming piece of plastic, yet it represented the absolute destruction of my entire family. I waited in the cold darkness for nearly 2 hours, my breathing slow and methodically controlled. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the crushing grief that had suffocated me at the cemetery. I felt only the supreme, terrifying clarity of a structural engineer preparing to initiate a timed, controlled demolition. At exactly 10 minutes past 8 in the evening, the mechanical hum of the private elevator echoed through the corridor outside. A soft chime signaled its arrival on the top floor. I tightened my grip on the armrests of the leather chair, my muscles locking into absolute readiness. I heard the muffled sound of approaching footsteps, followed by the electronic beep of the key fob scanning against the security panel. The heavy oak door swung inward, pushing against the darkness of the room. Derek stepped across the threshold, first wiping the rain from his face and shaking water from his expensive trench coat. Monica followed closely behind him, her injured arm cradled carefully against her chest. Damien was the last to enter, moving with that same arrogant grace I had witnessed through the hidden surveillance cameras just hours earlier. They did not notice me sitting in the shadows right away. They were too busy whispering frantically among themselves, their voices laced with a toxic mixture of greedy anticipation and lingering hostile tension. Derek reached toward the wall to flick on the overhead lights, but a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the entire living room. The bright electric glow caught the metallic surface of the empty hardware wallet resting on the glass table. Derek froze his hand, hovering inches away from the light switch. His eyes locked onto the small device with a ravenous, desperate intensity. In that fleeting moment of illumination, I saw the unfiltered greed consume his features. He let out a sharp gasp, immediately recognizing the encrypted vault he had been violently searching for all morning. His terrified gaze slowly tracked upward from the coffee table, finally landing on my silhouette, sitting silently in the dark corner of the room. He jumped backward, his heart leaping into his throat. He quickly fumbled for the wall switch, flooding the ruined penthouse with harsh artificial light. The sudden brightness revealed my stoic, unmoving posture. I stared directly at my son, my expression entirely devoid of any paternal warmth. The terrified criminal I had watched cowering on the floor earlier today vanished. Derek seamlessly transitioned into his practiced role of the devoted, deeply concerned child. He pasted a warm smile across his face, stepping carefully over a sliced leather cushion as he moved toward me. He asked how I was feeling, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy and fake relief. He told me he was so worried when I called earlier, claiming he had rushed over the exact moment he could quickly gather Monica and Damien together. He knelt down slowly, keeping a cautious, calculating distance, his eyes continuously darting back to the black device sitting on the table. He pointed a trembling finger at the empty ledger and asked me what it was, pretending complete ignorance. He asked if that was the secret document I had found belonging to his mother. He gently urged me to hand it over to him, promising that he would take care of all the complicated legal burdens so I could simply rest my failing heart. I did not answer him. I did not return his fraudulent smile. I slowly pushed myself up from the leather armchair, my movements deliberate. The pathetic, dying old man persona I had utilized on the telephone was gone. I stood tall, squaring my shoulders, projecting the commanding authority of a man who had spent 4 decades managing massive construction crews and demanding absolute obedience. Derek instinctively took a nervous step backward, unsettled by my sudden physical transformation. I ignored his reaction completely. I walked past my son, brushing shoulders with Monica, who was staring at me with a suspicious, narrowing gaze. I moved directly to the heavy oak door they had just walked through. I reached into the deep pockets of my winter coat and pulled out the thick, forged steel chain and the heavy titanium padlock I had purchased from the industrial supply store earlier that afternoon. The heavy metal clinked loudly in the tense silence of the room. I wrapped the heavy forged steel links tightly through the primary interior handles of the reinforced door, lacing the metal against the solid wood frame. Damien stepped forward from the entryway, his demeanor finally faltering. He asked me what on earth I was doing, his voice rising in alarm. I did not acknowledge his presence. I pulled the heavy chain taut, ensuring there was no slack left in the steel line. I slipped the titanium padlock through the overlapping metal loops and pressed the mechanism inward. A loud, sharp click echoed off the high ceiling, instantly and permanently severing our only physical connection to the outside world. The deadbolts were already engaged, and the reinforced steel barrier was now completely impenetrable. I turned around to face the 3 of them. I held the jagged brass key to the padlock tightly between my thumb and index finger, holding it up so the bright overhead lights caught the metal. Derek instantly raised his hands, his face draining of all natural color as raw panic set in. He desperately pleaded with me to stop asking exactly why I was locking them inside. He told me I was acting crazy and loudly begged me to hand him the key. I walked slowly toward the wall, where I had previously removed the metal grate from the HVAC ventilation shaft during my clandestine surveillance installation. I extended my arm over the dark, echoing abyss of the building's central ductwork. I looked directly into my son's terrified eyes, my gaze utterly cold and merciless. I unclasped my fingers, allowing the brass key to slip freely from my grip. The small piece of metal disappeared into the dark shaft, bouncing against the tin walls as it plummeted dozens of stories down into the inaccessible belly of the high-rise structure. I turned back to the room, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that sliced cleanly through the suffocating tension. That, Derek, is the exact price of my ruined life. Sit down. None of you are leaving this room. The absolute finality of my words hung in the air of the ruined penthouse. For a fleeting second, no one moved. The sound of torrential rain battering the glass windows was the only noise. Then the reality of the padlock and heavy steel chain registered. Panic shattered their carefully constructed facades. Derek stumbled backward, his breath catching in a pathetic gasp as his eyes darted between the reinforced door and my unyielding posture. Monica clutched her injured arm, her face twisting into a mask of genuine horror as she realized her extortion plot had just collided with a solid brick wall. Damien reacted differently. The arrogant young man in the silk robe decided to drop the polite real estate broker illusion completely. His features darkened into a vicious scowl. He took an aggressive step forward, puffing his chest in an attempt at physical intimidation. He demanded I unlock the door immediately, his voice devoid of the smooth tone he had utilized moments ago. He took another rapid step toward me, his hands balling into tight fists. He believed I was nothing more than a fragile old man who would easily crumble under the threat of physical violence. He was profoundly mistaken. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I calmly reached into the deep inner pocket of my heavy winter coat. My fingers wrapped securely around the textured grip of my licensed compact firearm. I drew the weapon with a fluid, practiced motion, the dark metal gleaming under the harsh lighting. I did not point the barrel at Damien. I did not need to. I simply walked over to the glass coffee table and placed the heavy firearm down with a loud, authoritative thud, setting it directly next to the matte black cryptocurrency ledger. I looked Damien squarely in the eyes, my expression radiating a cold, lethal calm. I told him to sit down. My voice did not raise in volume, but the commanding authority in my tone left no room for debate. Damien froze, his eyes locked onto the weapon resting on the table. The aggressive bravado evaporated from his posture, replaced by primal fear. He backed away, raising his hands in a submissive gesture, and carefully lowered himself onto the edge of a sliced leather sofa. Derek and Monica immediately followed suit, their bodies trembling as they sank onto the ruined furniture. The power dynamic had irreversibly shifted. They were no longer predators manipulating a blind victim. They were now captives trapped inside a reinforced cage of their own making. I remained standing behind the glass table, looking down at the three people who conspired to destroy my life. I reached into my pocket and withdrew a small black remote control. I aimed the device at the massive 80-inch flat-screen television mounted against the far wall of the living room. Derek watched my movements with desperate, hopeful intensity. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes wide and pleading. He mistakenly assumed the television screen would display the legal documents I had mentioned on the phone. He genuinely believed I was about to show them a digital copy of my last will and testament, transferring my remaining wealth into his greedy, waiting hands. I pressed the power button. The massive screen flickered to life, illuminating the dark corners of the room with a bright, pale glow. The television did not display a complex legal document. Instead, a high-definition video feed filled the massive screen. It was the exact panoramic view of the ruined living room we were currently standing in, recorded from the precise vantage point of the microscopic camera I had meticulously hidden deep inside the central ventilation duct. The digital audio feed crackled sharply through the surround sound speakers installed in the ceiling. The clear voices of Derek, Monica, and Damien echoed loudly across the room. The footage playing on the screen had been captured just a few hours ago. The three of them sat completely paralyzed, their eyes wide with unadulterated shock, as they watched their own treacherous actions unfold before them. They watched themselves pacing across the plaster dust. They listened to the undeniable, recorded proof of their monumental deception. I stood silently as the video reached the devastating moment. The audio captured Derek whining pathetically to Monica, detailing how he systematically embezzled $8 million from my retirement accounts to desperately save his failing tech startup and fund his secret lavish lifestyle with Damien. Derek watched his own digital confession, his mouth hanging open in silent horror. The blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution. But the recording was not finished. The video continued playing, Reaching the exact moment, Monica shoved Derek violently against the damaged drywall. Her shrill, venomous voice filled the room once again. She proudly detailed how she confronted Martha in the speeding car. She callously described grabbing the steering wheel and violently forcing the vehicle into the concrete barrier to secure her financial payout. She openly admitted to causing the fatal crash and purposefully lying to the investigating police officers about a sudden heart attack. The impact of her recorded confession was instantaneous and catastrophic. Monica let out a high-pitched guttural scream of absolute terror. She leaped up from the ruined sofa, her injured arm forgotten as she frantically backed away from the television screen. She turned her wild, panicked gaze toward her husband. She screamed at Derek, wildly accusing him of setting her up, completely losing her grip on reality, as the insurmountable weight of a vehicular manslaughter charge crashed down upon her. She lunged at him, her uninjured hand clawing desperately at his shirt, shrieking that he deliberately led them into a trap. Derek shoved her away with a sudden violent burst of adrenaline. His eyes were wide and manic, darting wildly around the locked room. His mind desperately calculated his rapidly vanishing options. His gaze locked onto the small, matte black cryptocurrency ledger resting on the glass coffee table right next to the firearm. In his terrified, crumbling mind, that tiny plastic device was his only remaining salvation. He believed the $12 million secured inside that digital vault could buy him a ruthless defense attorney or a private flight out of the country. With a guttural, animalistic roar, Derek lunged forward. He threw his entire body toward the glass table, his hands desperately reaching out to snatch the hardware wallet. He expected me to dive for the gun. He expected a chaotic physical struggle. I did absolutely nothing else. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting casually at my sides. I watched my son snatch the black plastic device from the table, clutching it to his chest, as if his very life depended on it. I looked down at his terrified, sweating face, and a cold, dark laugh finally escaped my lips. The sound echoed harshly over the heavy pouring rain. "Take it," I said, my voice dripping with absolute unfiltered contempt. "Take it, Derek. It is completely empty." I successfully transferred all $12 million into an irrevocable offshore trust for Sarah this morning. The absolute silence that followed my declaration was heavier than the steel chain locking the heavy oak door. Derek stood frozen, his trembling fingers clutching the small black piece of plastic against his chest. His brain could simply not process the catastrophic reality of my words. He frantically turned the hardware wallet over in his hands, pressing the small activation button on the side. The tiny digital screen flickered to life, glowing faintly in the dim lighting of the ruined penthouse. I watched his eyes dart rapidly across the microscopic text displaying the current balance. $0. 0 cents. The $12.5 million he had sacrificed his own mother to protect was completely gone. The physical reaction was instantaneous and entirely pathetic. Derek let out a hollow, agonizing gasp, as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from the room. His legs buckled beneath him. He dropped heavily to his knees, the sharp shards of broken crystal crunching loudly under his weight. He stared at the empty device in his hand, a look of profound, unadulterated devastation washing over his pale face. The arrogant technology executive, the mastermind who had callously orchestrated the complete liquidation of my life savings, was instantly reduced to a weeping, broken child. He dropped the useless piece of plastic onto the floor and crawled toward the glass coffee table, stopping just inches away from where my licensed firearm rested. He looked up at me, hot tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning any remaining shred of dignity. He began to beg. His voice was a high-pitched, frantic whine that grated against my ears. He swore to me that he never wanted any of this to happen. He desperately tried to shift the entire burden of guilt onto the woman we had buried 3 days ago. He cried that his mother was the one who had forged my signature, that Martha had been the sole architect of the financial deception because she could not bear to see his startup fail. He claimed he was just a victim of her obsessive, overbearing love. He begged me to understand the immense pressure he was under, pleading with me to reverse the offshore transfer. He promised he would pay me back every single penny if I just gave him access to the funds to appease his creditors. I looked down at my weeping son with absolute revulsion. Before I could even formulate a response to his pathetic groveling, Monica forcefully injected herself into the chaotic fray. The realization that the fortune was gone had completely shattered her own vicious extortion plot. She was now trapped in a locked room facing a father-in-law who had just listened to a crystal-clear audio recording of her confessing to vehicular manslaughter. Pure animalistic self-preservation took over. Monica stepped over the debris, creating a deliberate physical distance between herself and her kneeling husband. She looked at me, forcing her panicked features into an expression of desperate victimhood. She pointed a trembling, uninjured finger directly at Derek. Her voice shook with manufactured outrage as she frantically attempted to rewrite the narrative. She told me I had to believe her, claiming she had been entirely manipulated by my son from the very beginning. She swore she never meant to hurt Martha in the car. She desperately spun a new frantic lie, insisting that Derek had threatened her life if she did not confront his mother on that remote highway. She cried that the physical struggle in the vehicle was a terrible accident, a tragic consequence of the immense psychological terror Derek had subjected her to for years. She begged me to see her as a hostage in her own marriage, pleading with me to let her walk out of this room so she could help me put Derek behind bars where he truly belonged. Her desperate attempt to play the innocent victim was nauseating. She had proudly bragged about murdering my wife just 20 minutes ago, and now she was begging for my paternal mercy. As Monica continued her hysterical pleading, Damien realized the sinking ship was rapidly taking on water. The young man in the dark silk lounging robe understood that his wealthy benefactor was completely ruined, and his own luxurious lifestyle was evaporating before his eyes. He backed away from the shattered bar cart, his hands raised in a cautious, defensive posture. Damien looked at me, his smooth voice trembling slightly, as he tried to carefully distance himself from the catastrophic fallout. He told me he was just a pawn in this sprawling family drama. He claimed he had absolutely no idea the money funding his lifestyle was stolen from my retirement accounts. He insisted Derek had lied to him, presenting himself as a wildly successful technology CEO. Damien swore he was completely oblivious to the horrific car crash and the violent extortion plot unfolding between the married couple. He begged me to unlock the heavy steel chain, promising he would quietly walk out the door, disappear from Seattle tonight, and never contact my son ever again. I stood silently behind the glass coffee table, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I watched the three of them turn on each other like starving wolves in a locked cage. The absolute lack of loyalty, the immediate willingness to sacrifice one another to save their own skin was the final confirmation I needed. There was no redemption left in this room. There was no misunderstanding to clarify. There was only a profound toxic rot that had consumed my family from the inside out. I looked at Derek, still kneeling in the broken glass. I looked at Monica, trembling with desperate, venomous fear. And I looked at Damien, cowering near the wall. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to establish absolute dominance over the space. My tone was low, steady, and dripping with an icy, unforgiving finality. "You thought I was a clueless old man," I said, the words cutting sharply through their frantic pleading. "You thought I was a senile cash cow, too blind and too exhausted to ever see the truth happening right in front of me. You believed you could dismantle my entire existence, steal my life savings, and literally murder my wife without facing a single consequence. You assumed I would quietly fade away into the shadows." I paused, letting the heavy silence amplify the weight of my words. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands flat against the cool surface of the glass table. "But an engineer knows exactly when a foundation is completely rotten," I continued, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "An engineer understands that when the structural integrity of a building is fatally compromised by toxic parasites, you do not try to patch the cracks. You do not try to repair it. You demolish it, and you burn the rubble to the ground." The color completely drained from their terrified faces. They stared at me, paralyzed by the cold, calculated execution of my judgment. I slowly reached into the deep pocket of my heavy winter coat and pulled out my mobile cellular device. I placed it gently onto the glass table right next to the empty black ledger and the loaded firearm. The screen was brightly illuminated, displaying an active, ongoing phone call. The call duration timer showed it had been continuously connected for the past 25 minutes. I looked directly into my son's horrified eyes, delivering the final, devastating blow. I told them I had not just been recording their twisted confessions for my own personal entertainment. I explained that I had dialed a direct emergency line before they even stepped out of the private elevator. I informed them that the Seattle Police Department Homicide Division and the Federal Financial Crimes Unit had been sitting on the other end of this live audio feed for the entire duration of their visit. They had heard every single word, every threat, and every detailed admission of guilt. A haunting, absolute silence enveloped the ruined penthouse as the inescapable reality of their situation finally crushed them. Derek opened his mouth, but no sound came out. And then, cutting through the ambient noise of the heavy rain battering the floor-to-ceiling windows, a new sound emerged from the city streets far below. It started as a faint, distant wail. Within seconds, it multiplied, growing exponentially louder and more aggressive. The piercing, unmistakable shriek of dozens of police sirens echoed through the stormy Seattle night. The flashing red and blue emergency lights began to reflect brightly against the rain-soaked glass of the penthouse windows, quickly surrounding the entire perimeter of the luxury high-rise building. The demolition was officially complete. There was absolutely nowhere left to run. Loyalty that requires you to sacrifice your integrity is not love. It is manipulation. In life, we often build our worlds around people we assume will protect our foundations, only to discover they are the termites quietly destroying it from within. When you uncover a painful truth about those closest to you, do not close your eyes for the sake of false peace. Have the courage to demolish the rotten structures in your life. It is better to stand alone in the truth than to live comfortably in a lie. Real family is built on respect, not just blood. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever discovered a shocking truth about someone you trusted? Share your experience in the comments below. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and I'll see you in the next story.